All right, buckle up, history buffs, because today we're diving headfirst into the rise of Western Christendom.
A real humdinger of a topic.
We're talking about Peter Brown's The Rise of Western Christendom, and let me tell you, this isn't your grandma's Sunday school lesson.
No, not unless your grandma was a scholar. It's a pretty dense read, but fascinating stuff.
Definitely dense, but that's why we're here, to unpack it all.
Exactly.
I always pictured, early Christianity exploding across Europe, everyone ditching their old gods like yesterday's news. But Brown throws a real curveball at that idea.
Right from the get-go, he challenges that whole uniformity thing. It wasn't like someone flipped a switch, boom, Christendom.
Yeah. And I always imagined those barbarian invasions as this sudden hostile takeover.
Right, like a scene from Gladiator. But Brown brings up, for example, the scholar Neil McClin, who points out how poems from that time barely bat an eye at these so-called invaders.
Interesting.
It's way more about this slow burn,
Yeah.
Roman power fading, civil wars, everyday people digging in their heels.
So it wasn't Rome falls, everyone becomes a barbarian overnight.
Not even close.
Yeah.
It's this messy, fascinating mix. You see regional differences popping up, these cultural blends emerging from the chaos.
Okay, so speaking of messy and fascinating, let's talk about what early Western Christianity actually looked like on the ground. Because honestly, it wasn't what I expected. Less focus on sin and the afterlife right out of the gate.
Yeah, that's one of the things Brown highlights.
And this weird blurring of pagan rituals and Christian practices. Even the monks weren't these isolated saints we picture, were they?
No way. It's almost like they were trying to fit this new faith into their existing ways of life, wouldn't you say?
Totally. So instead of a clean break from the past.
It's more like they're building on top of it.
And Brown uses Augustine as an example, right? That super influential theologian.
Oh yeah, Augustine's a big deal.
And he basically said, look, the church has its fair share of regular people, not just saints.
Exactly. He believed in God's grace for everyone, no matter how devout they were.
See, that just blows my mind. We tend to picture early Christians as these, superhumanly pious folks.
Right.
But Augustine's like, nope, we've got room for everybody.
He understood that people came with baggage,
Mm-hmm.
their old beliefs, their superstitions. He didn't try to erase all of that overnight.
Because that's how you actually get people to listen, right? You meet them where they are.
Exactly. It's like Augustine even mentions his own parishioners still believing in demons.
Demons, but that's not exactly official church doctrine.
Right. But he understood that those beliefs were ingrained, This blending of old and new was essential for Christianity to take root.
Especially in a world where everything felt like it was falling apart. Right? I mean, the Roman Empire, the ultimate symbol of order, is crumbling all around them.
It's like hold on to something familiar, something that makes sense, even as everything else changes.
Okay, so it's less about out with the old and more
in with the new, but let's make it feel familiar.
Like renovating a house. You keep some of the original structure, but make it work for how we live now.
That's a great analogy. It's wild, right? How this new faith gets woven into the very fabric of society.
Yeah.
And, something that always gets me about this whole period is how the power dynamics come into play.
Oh, totally. You'd think, even with Rome on the decline, they'd still be calling the shots on something as big as religion.
Right. Like, you answer to Caesar even on Sundays.
Exactly. But Brown paints a totally different picture. Suddenly you've got these bishops acting like regional power players, monks from fancy families pulling strings.
Oh, yeah, those aristocratic monks. Brown talks about how they were basically celebrities of their time.
And conversion, it's not just about saving souls anymore. It's like a power move for ambitious locals.
Totally. It's about who gets a seat at the table in this new world order. And religion, that's your ticket in.
Like a spiritual VIP pass.
Exactly. Think about it. The Roman Empire, this massive power structure, it's crumbling. Suddenly there's this vacuum, and religion becomes a major player in the scramble to fill it.
It's like everyone's vying for influence in this new world.
Exactly. And bishops, who are often from wealthy families themselves, they step into this role of intermediary between everyday people and this distant, weakening empire.
Talk about a prime opportunity to gain some serious clout.
No kidding. And Brown even talks about this idea of strategic conversion. It's not always about genuine faith. It's about, convert or get left behind.
Don't miss the boat to the new world.
Exactly. And one of the best examples, Clovis, the Frankish king. You know that story, right?
Go on.
He's about to lose this huge battle, prays for a miracle, and bam. Divine intervention, at least, that's the story that gets spread around.
Whether it actually happened that way, who knows?
Right. But it did the trick, didn't it? It's a classic example of using religion to legitimize power.
So smart. Even if it was a bit, opportunistic.
Totally. And that's what I love about history, right? The stories, true or not, they become the reality that people build on.
It's all about how the story gets told, right?
Right.
And speaking of stories, Brown is such a good storyteller.
Oh, absolutely. He really brings this period to life.
He throws in these amazing anecdotes. Like, remember that bit about the Irish monks chewing horse flesh for inspiration before writing poetry?
Oh, yeah. Like, they couldn't just grab a cup of coffee like the rest of us?
Right. But Brown uses that detail to make a point, right?
Totally. He's highlighting how they were tapping into these ancient Celtic beliefs about sacrifice, about ritual, even as they're forging this new Christian identity.
It's like they're saying, we're changing the message, but we're keeping the language familiar.
Exactly. It's about making a new faith fit into existing frameworks. And the adaptation wasn't just about rituals or symbols, It was about how people understood their place in the world.
So how does that play out?
Well, Brown talks about the power of Christian storytelling. The lives of saints, martyrs, even everyday folks get woven into these epic narratives.
Like creating a whole new mythology for this new world. And it's not just word of mouth. Brown talks about those amazing journeys of physical manuscripts, like that one gospel that goes from Roman ruins to ending up in the hands of Saxon kings. It's mind-blowing.
Isn't that something? That one manuscript, it represents this massive spread of knowledge, the building blocks of a shared Christian culture. Imagine these texts traveling across continents, shaping entire societies.
It makes you think about the power of the written word, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And then you have figures like Charlemagne who come along and push for standardized writing, a unified Christian culture. He understood the power of literacy, how it could unify a kingdom.
Talk about playing the long game. It really makes you think about the reach of these historical figures, right?
Absolutely. But, there's a thought that always creeps in when I think about this spread of Western Christendom.
Oh, tell me more.
Well, Brown does a great job of showing us the Western perspective.
Right. It's Western Christendom we're talking about here.
Exactly. But it's only one side of the story, isn't it?
So who are we missing in this grand narrative?
That's the question, isn't it? What about the Saxons on the receiving end of these new religious ideas? Or the people in the Middle East who had their own rich traditions?
It's like we're only getting half the story.
Right. Brown himself acknowledges this. He's writing from the perspective of the winners, the folks who got to write the history books, literally. But those other voices, the ones who were often silenced or overlooked, they matter too.
Because their experiences might paint a very different picture.
Exactly. It reminds us that history isn't always about finding the right answers, but about asking the right questions.
And digging a little deeper, right?
Absolutely. Who gets to tell the story? Whose voices are amplified? And whose are silenced? Those questions matter just as much as the events themselves.
It's a good reminder for us as we explore any historical period, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Don't just take the textbook version for granted.
Nope. Question everything. Look for the gaps. And you might be surprised by what you discover.
And that's what makes history so fascinating, isn't it?
Totally. It's a never-ending puzzle. And the more perspectives we uncover, the richer and more complex the picture becomes.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the rise of Western Christendom, remember, it's not just about dates and names.
It's about understanding the human stories behind those events.
Be curious, challenge your assumptions, and keep exploring the fascinating world of history.